All right, there we go. All right, sorry about that. Hello and greetings from North Dakota. My name is Eric Johnson, and I am the Digital Library Coordinator and Archivist here at the Theodore Roosevelt Center at Dickinson State University. How's everyone doing today? Good, well, I'm excited to be here to talk to you a little bit about Theodore Roosevelt and take a look at some of the primary sources we have. Just to give you a little background about where I work before I jump into talking about Theodore Roosevelt. The Theodore Roosevelt Center is a digital library that aims to collect and digitize any and all documents related to Theodore Roosevelt. The bulk of our materials come from the Library of Congress's collection of Theodore Roosevelt papers, but we've also partnered with a variety of institutions and individuals across the country who have an interest in Roosevelt. These include places ranging from Harvard University, where Roosevelt attended college, to public libraries, historical societies, and individuals who have collected materials created or related to Theodore Roosevelt. While some of our materials are available other places on the internet, our goal is to bring all these materials together in one spot and describe them in order to make them more easily found and used by researchers, scholars, and the general public like you. Now, actually getting into today's topic, Theodore Roosevelt was, before, during, and after his presidency, a figure of almost overwhelming vitality who came into contact with locations and events across the globe. Described by one of his friends as a figure of pure act, Roosevelt was a naturalist, historian, author, hunter, cowboy, in addition to being one of the most popular presidents in American history. Through the course of his life, Theodore Roosevelt touched a massive number of places, not only within the United States, but around the world, building his legacy, his larger-than-life legacy that we see today. Before I get into talking about the areas Theodore Roosevelt touched and where he left his mark in history, do any of you have any guesses about places I might talk about? Where do you think of when you hear the name Theodore Roosevelt?
Where do you think? We forgot.
Oh, that's all right. Anybody else? Anybody else have any ideas?
Come up here. Okay, what do you think?
I think of a different president.
Good.
Okay, so you think he's a president? Yeah.
One place. Yeah. Good. One place you might think of lots of different presidents that I have a picture of here, if you can see, Mount Rushmore. So you're right. Theodore Roosevelt is associated with lots of different presidents as well as just himself. Now, as I said, Theodore Roosevelt is associated with lots of places. So if I had all the time in the world, I could just go on for hours about all the places, but we don't have all the time in the world. So instead, I've made up a list of just a few of the places that I thought were the most important, interesting, or just a little well-known than others to talk about today. To start, I thought I'd begin more or less chronologically with the Badlands of North Dakota. Oh, before I go, I just want to ask, my slide is not changing. Do you see the slide changing? Do we have a postcard here right now? Okay, good. Awesome. Yep. Just wanted to make sure. It was something weird with that thing. But, okay. To start, I thought I'd begin more or less chronologically with the Badlands of North Dakota, which was significant not only in Roosevelt's personal life, but which still claims strong ties to him today. Theodore Roosevelt is frequently quoted as having said that he would not have been president had it not been for his experience in North Dakota, and that it was in western North Dakota that the romance of his life began. Roosevelt first visited the Badlands in 1883, at a time when traveling to the west to hunt buffalo was a trendy thing for dudes from New York to do, and when the Dakota Badlands were in the midst of a cattle boom. While hunting buffalo during this first visit to the Badlands, Roosevelt was attracted to the prospect of investing in cattle ranching, and contracted some men to stock and run a cattle ranch for him before he returned to New York to serve as an assemblyman in their government. More than simply being attracted to the potential profits of cattle ranching, however, Roosevelt fell in love with the land itself, and an acquaintance of Roosevelt later wrote of Roosevelt's wild enthusiasm over the Badlands, and that it had taken root in the congenial coil of his consciousness, like an ineradicable creeping plant, as it were, to thrive and permeate it thereafter, causing him more and more to think of the broad gauge terms of nature, of the real earth. Looking at the slide here, you can see we've got a postcard here that was created a little later, but it shows one of Roosevelt's cabins that he lived in while he was there in the Badlands, as well as a legal document here that sets out the brands that he used on his cattle. We've got the Maltese Cross here that he used for one of his ranches, and then these two other brands that he used on the Elkhorn. He had two different ranches in North Dakota. So both of the factors I mentioned, Roosevelt's investment in cattle ranching and his love of the land, would provide him a safe haven to turn to the following year after suffering both political defeat and the tragic deaths of both his wife and mother. They died at about the same time, and it just threw his life out of whack. In June of 1884, Roosevelt turned to the Badlands, seeking an escape from the painful memories of New York in the solace of the wide open plains. During this period, Roosevelt threw himself into living life as a cowboy, writing, "Lack care rarely sits behind a rider whose pace is fast enough," and doing everything he could to beat back the sadness and despair that threatened to catch up with him. Much of this involved both riding and hunting. And here we can see a picture of Roosevelt with one of his horses from 1884. Let's see. So here, you can see he looks rather different from the barrel-chested president we often think of. And here we've got a couple pages from his diary. On this one here, you can see he's listing all the animals that he hunted on that day. And the page is pretty full. He did a lot of hunting. As he spent more time here in North Dakota, Roosevelt grew fond of the rough landscape, writing to his sister Bammy that, and I apologize, the book's a little long, but it certainly has a desolate, grim beauty of its own that has a curious fascination for me. The grassy, scantily wooded bottoms through which the winding river flows are bounded by bare, jagged buttes. Their fantastic shapes and sharp, steep edges throw the most curious shadows under the cloudless, glaring sky. And at evening, I love to sit out in front of the hut and see their hard gray outlines gradually growing soft and purple as the flaming sunset, by degrees, softens and dies away. While my days I spend generally alone, riding through the lonely rolling prairie and broken land. So you can definitely see that this sort of landscape that we have here definitely touched something in Roosevelt for him to have waxed poetic at such length. And indeed, here and later in his life, Roosevelt was deeply moved by the beauty and majesty of natural landscapes. Over the next couple of years, Roosevelt started shifting back towards living in the East, but still spent a great deal of time in the Badlands and was proud of his accomplishments there. Here on the right, we've got a couple portraits that Theodore Roosevelt had made of himself in New York in 1885, showing off the buckskin clothing that he had specially requested be made for him. Even after marrying his second wife, Edith, and resuming elements of his life in New York, he continued to return to the Badlands to go on hunting trips for many years, and took inspiration from it for such books as Hunting Trips of a Ranchman, like you see here, or other works like his history, The Winning of the West, or Ranch Life on the Hunting Trail, which I've got a copy of here from our digital library. Well, Roosevelt had already begun to develop a bit of a political reputation even before he turned to ranching in North Dakota. This period of his life would greatly reshape that image and stick with him for a long time. Indeed, his cowboy image became a favorite touchstone when discussing Roosevelt. For example, after Theodore Roosevelt assumed the presidency in the wake of William McKinley's death, Mark Hanna, the chair of the Republican National Committee, remarked, "Now look, that damned cowboy is the president of the United States." Here we can see a couple other ways that this has surfaced during Roosevelt's lifetime and after, with Roosevelt appearing in the guise of a cowboy both in advertisements, like you see here, or political cartoons. We've got Theodore Roosevelt wearing his cowboy hat and spurs. Here he's throwing a lasso over one of the trusts, during a roundup, or in articles that he himself wrote. Here's one, a couple pages from an article titled "In Cowboy Land." So Roosevelt definitely loved this period of his life and continued to go back to it throughout. Now, before I jump to a different location, I should also mention that while North Dakota played an important role in the life of Theodore Roosevelt, it is also an important place in shaping how he is remembered today. One of the things that Theodore Roosevelt is known for is his efforts promoting conservation, establishing the United States Forest Service, creating a large number of national forests, federal bird reserves, game reserves, parks, monuments, as you can see here. So it seems fitting, therefore, that Roosevelt gets a park named after him. So the area where Roosevelt once lived and ranched is now part of Theodore Roosevelt National Park here in North Dakota. And this is the only national park that's named after a single person. Here you can see we've got the legal document setting out establishing this national park, as well as one of the early signs. It started out as a regional park. This regional park was originally worked by the Civilian Conservation Corps, but it now consists, the national park consists of 3 distinct units. There's a northern and southern unit, as well as a little unit in the middle around where his Elkhorn Ranch used to be. The park memorializes both Roosevelt's experiences living and ranching in North Dakota, as well as his efforts to conserve the natural environment through an interpretive center and several wilderness areas in both major units of the park. Here you can see some of the variety of materials the Theodore Roosevelt Center has. From postcards and photographs, these are kind of showing the surrounding area, similar to the photos I showed you earlier, showing the old gate of the park with this statue on it. There's a new gate now, but you can still hike out to see this old gate, and it's really neat. So we have those, but we also have more legal documents like this, which go over some of the discussions about creating the wilderness area within the park. Places where there aren't roads and you have to hike out to really preserve the environment as it would have been during Theodore Roosevelt's time. Now, if the Dakota Badlands represent a formative location in Roosevelt's life that he is still associated with, the same can be said of San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill as kernel of his Rough Riders. While he had already gained some renown or notoriety, depending on who you spoke to, prior to his service here, his military service certainly helped contribute toward his election as governor of New York, his choice as vice presidential candidate, and his eventual assumption of the presidency itself. Bradley Gilman writes in his book, Roosevelt the Happy Warrior, that once a classmate of Roosevelt asked Roosevelt what act or experience of his past had been the most joyous. And Roosevelt, after a moment's reflection, replied, the charge up San Juan Hill. Now, how many of you have already heard of Roosevelt as a Rough Rider, or know when he led them up these hills? Any ideas? You might not have gotten there yet. Anyone have any ideas? That's all right. I'm sure you'll get to it in history classes eventually.
Want to guess?
Oh, sorry, yes?
I think he was called a Rough Rider because they rode on rough trails.
All right, good guess. You're right, Roosevelt did ride on rough trails a lot of the time, but so the idea of the Rough Rider is actually applied to his whole regiment. So Roosevelt led this regiment during the Spanish-American War of 1898, when the United States went to war with Spain and invaded Cuba and the Philippines. And you're right, a lot of the roads that he rode on during that war were probably pretty rough. So before this, though, during his time as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Roosevelt had frequently advocated that the United States should increase its naval strength to make sure its military was prepared in case it found itself going to war. He also favored intervention in Cuba against the oppressive Spanish government. After the battleship Maine blew up in Havana Harbor and the United States began to move toward war with Spain, he saw an opportunity for him to give substance to his words, writing to one of his friends that, my power for good, whatever it may be, would be gone if I didn't try to live up to the doctrines I have tried to preach. Now, while other members of the administration thought he might have been a bit crazy for leaving the safety of his desk here as Assistant Secretary of the Navy for the front lines, as Colonel Roosevelt here, you can see in his military uniform, the sentiment of giving substance to his words drove Roosevelt to resign his post and join and advocate for the creation of the first United States Voluntary Cavalry Regiment, or what would eventually become known as Roosevelt's Rough Riders. So Roosevelt initially declined formal command of the regiment, citing his lack of experience in hard military organization. But he gladly took the position of second in command as lieutenant colonel behind his friend Leonard Wood. In spite of this, as Edmund Morris writes, while Roosevelt, Secretary Alger, the President, and Congress might imagine Wood to be the true commander of the regiment, the American public was not fooled, and they quickly moved to give the regiment a host of Rooseveltian nicknames before settling on Roosevelt's Rough Riders. Eventually, as a result of illnesses in the Army, Wood was promoted to command of the 2nd Brigade and elevated Roosevelt to the full colonelcy, shortly before what would prove to be his most famous battle. The Battle of San Juan and the Rough Riders' charge of Kettle Hill and San Juan Heights, which we have a painting of here, you can see, would prove to be one of Roosevelt's defining moments, both personally and publicly. During this attack, Roosevelt led his men on a dangerous charge up these hills to dislodge the Spanish forces and seize the high ground. Following the Spanish surrender of Cuba, Roosevelt wrote to a friend that I would rather have led that charge and earned my colonelcy than served 3 terms in the United States Senate. Despite this downplaying of his political ambitions, however, Roosevelt returned to the United States to find himself the most famous man in America, and was quickly barraged with questions about his plans to run for governor of New York. Even later, after his terms as president were over, Roosevelt valued his time as a Rough Rider and his position in the Army, and once again adopted the title of colonel. He even petitioned to be allowed to form a similar unit to fight in World War I, although this request was ultimately denied. So here you can see we've got a picture of the full Rough Rider regiment with Roosevelt right there in the middle under the flag. And this happened after this battle. This is actually on San Juan Heights, I believe, that they took through the charge. So the image of Roosevelt as a Rough Rider leading a charge up Kettle Hill became one of the most favored images used to depict Roosevelt during his lifetime, especially with political cartoonists. With the image of Theodore Roosevelt as a Rough Rider being variously applied to political campaigns, you can see here, we've got Roosevelt in his Rough Rider garb. He's got a sword clenched in his teeth, and he's going for the nomination for governor. So it's being applied to political campaigns. Here, he's dressed as a Rough Rider charging against the trust. Here, he's just celebrating the 4th of July. So even when it wasn't used to show as a part of a political campaign, just having his colonel's uniform served as an instantly recognizable symbol, joining Theodore Roosevelt's glasses and toothy grin as common iconography. Artists use to suggest Theodore Roosevelt's presence or Rooseveltian ideas. So one of the uses of Rough Rider imagery actually is applied here to another significant location in Roosevelt's life and memory, with Roosevelt leading a group of rough diggers to Panama to work on the canal there. How many of you have heard of the Panama Canal? It's still famous even today. I see a couple of hands, good. So while Roosevelt's presidency contained a host of notable moments, both internally and internationally, after he left office, he wrote that the one thing he felt he deserved the most credit for in his entire administration was his action in seizing the psychological moment to get complete control of Panama and making the canal. So the Panama Canal, just in case you haven't heard of it, is the canal that connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And the necessity of such a canal has long been viewed as a matter of not if, but when, by many Americans, both because of the influence it would have on trade, letting people get from ocean to ocean and coast to coast much faster, as well as increasing the mobility and power of American naval forces in case of war. Plans for constructing such a canal had been under discussion for several years by this point. While both Panama and Nicaragua had been discussed as possibilities, by early 1902, Roosevelt seems to have favored the Panamanian option, and with the approval of Congress, began to move forward trying to come to an agreement with the government of Colombia, which at that time controlled Panama. These negotiations were very frustrating for both the United States and Colombia, with both nations considering that the other one was making unreasonable demands. Colombia on its side asked for more money from the United States and was understandably reluctant to give up some of its sovereignty, while the United States thought that Colombia was just delaying for too long, and it tried to use its not insubstantial influence to just muscle the Colombian government into speeding up the process and giving in to its demands. Here we've got a picture. So this is after everything is settled. This is a picture of Roosevelt on one of the steam engines that was used to dig the canal. If you can see, he's this figure in white here on his visit. This letter here is where he was saying that he believes that the most important thing that his administration would do was the creation of the canal, like I had mentioned earlier. So eventually, after the Colombian government rejected the treaty allowing for the construction of a canal, Panama revolted and declared its independence from Colombia. While Roosevelt and the American government may not have directly incited such a rebellion, the possibility of it was certainly understood by those in government, and there was a determination that, one way or the other, the United States would construct a canal connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Indeed, Roosevelt later declared in a letter that, if they had not revolted, I should have recommended Congress to take possession of the isthmus by force of arms. It's unfortunately a little blurry to read here, but I believe it's about here in the letter. This is the one where he says that. As it was, however, the Panamanian people revolted, although still with some outside help, and the newly formed and recognized government proceeded to ratify a treaty with the United States allowing for the creation of the canal. This instance, along with Roosevelt's earlier treatment of a dispute between several European nations and Venezuela, became part of the foundation of what came to be known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was set out by President Monroe, basically saying that European powers should stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt's corollary to that situated the United States as an international police power within the Western Hemisphere, over its neighboring countries in Latin America, ensuring that they act with reasonable efficiency and decency in social and political matters. Such policy leads to another image of Roosevelt that political cartoons give us, that of the international policeman wielding his famous big stick, as you can see here. He's got his policeman's garb on. Here he has his colonel's uniform from the Rough Riders again, but in both he's carrying the big stick. Now, the idea of Roosevelt's big stick actually comes from another saying. Have any of you heard it before by any chance? It's all right if you haven't. So the first quote, the full quote, if you haven't heard it, is, "Speak softly and carry a big stick. You shall go far." And this is actually an African proverb, which leads me into the next location that had an impact on Theodore Roosevelt's life and shapes how he is viewed today. So as I already said, Theodore Roosevelt was almost always full of energy, living what he called the strenuous life. So it should come as no surprise that he would continue to fill the years after his presidency with adventures. Even before the 1908 election, Roosevelt knew that if he remained at home, he might have a hard time not interfering, or seeming to interfere, in the presidency of his presumed successor, William Howard Taft. With that thought in mind, Roosevelt arranged to go on a safari in East Africa, hoping to both appease his desire for adventure and reach a place where the press can't get at me and where I cannot hear what is going on, so that he couldn't be accused of wishing to interfere with the methods of his successor. As you might be able to see in this letter here, getting down towards the bottom, but he appears to have been at least somewhat successful in that, as he writes, "I am happy to say that I know nothing whatever of politics at home. and I hope to keep in the same blessed state of ignorance until I return next June. Here we have just got a picture of Roosevelt in Africa. He was riding on a cow catcher to be able to see all the animals. So, as Roosevelt planned his safari and pulled together details for nearly a year, his expedition grew from merely a hunting adventure to a scientific expedition, partially sponsored by the Smithsonian, and which would be accompanied by a variety of zoological experts, guides, porters, as well as one of Roosevelt's own sons. In spite of his reputation placing him as a big game hunter, Roosevelt seems to have definitely wanted this expedition to be taken seriously as a scientific enterprise, saying frequently that his party killed only what they needed for use as scientific specimens or for use as food. Here we've got a postcard of the expedition. We've got Roosevelt with his pith helmet and safari gear, and a couple of the people who went with him as experts. And here we've got Roosevelt actually on safari with some of the people who traveled with him. This was one of the carts that brought all their materials along with them as well. So indeed, Roosevelt got many chances to try to communicate that this was a scientific expedition, as well as the benefits from his safari, as he documented his travels thoroughly in a series of articles he wrote for Scribner's magazine. These articles would later be compiled into Roosevelt's book, African Game Trails, which I have a copy of here. You can see that through the camera. The slide, however, shows a part of the book in Roosevelt's own handwriting from when he was writing it on safari, along with his working title, African Wanderings of a Hunter Naturalist, which again put equal billing on hunting and naturalist pursuits. So he really wanted to emphasize that this was a scientific expedition. As much as he said that, however, his reputation as a hunter clearly preceded him, with many musical pieces being made like these, Teddy After Africa, When Teddy Got to Jungleville, or Teddy the Jungle Boogeyman. Or like the short cartoon I'll show you in just a second. It is an old cartoon, so it is unfortunately silent, but it's still kind of fun to see. Just about there. It says, Teddy's arrival caused some commotion in the jungle. And there comes Theodore Roosevelt. You can see all the animals were up in the tree scared of him. This was clearly a popular sort of sentiment that Roosevelt was coming to try and get all the animals. So as you may have guessed, there was a bit of truth to both these perspectives. On one hand, Theodore Roosevelt did his best to collect and prepare a variety of specimens to send to the Smithsonian, which the institution long had on display. On the other hand, Roosevelt hunted a tremendous number of animals, sending tens of thousands of specimens to the Smithsonian, divided among 160 species of carnivores, ungulates, rodents, insectivores, and bats. In this picture, we can see one of Theodore Roosevelt's personal journals, similar to the one from the Badlands that I showed you earlier, where he describes what he was hunting this day. Here you can see he was hunting giraffes, and he marks down how exactly he hunted them. Here we can also see some of the final product with a number of stuffed rhinoceroses on this display. So even though looking back on this today, this sort of big game hunting does not seem like a good thing. During this point in time, his actions did do some good work in allowing people who would never have had the chance to see these animals in the wild experience them in museums. Theodore Roosevelt's African safari was a great adventure, and even though Roosevelt tried to avoid excessive press coverage, his safari was reported on extensively, and Roosevelt was wildly celebrated when he returned to the United States in June of 1910. Roosevelt's safari was not, however, his last adventure. Just a couple months after Theodore Roosevelt lost his bid as the Progressive Party candidate in the 1912 presidential election, Argentina's Museo Social invited the ex-president to give a speech to their members. This led to a South American adventure that would prove to be one of Roosevelt's most dangerous, and one which resulted in a river getting named after him. So in the early 1900s, the Amazon rainforest was largely unexplored. It was just a big blank spot on the map, and one which promised to provide a veritable treasure trove of previously unrecorded plants, animals, and insects. As with his 1909 trip to Africa, Roosevelt turns to the American Museum of Natural History to see if it might be possible to expand his speaking tour into an expedition that would help expand scientific knowledge. At this point in time, Roosevelt thought that his trip would be nothing more than a delightful holiday appended to his speaking tour, and one that would provide just the right amount of adventure by allowing him to travel some South American rivers and collect plants and wildlife specimens. When the foreign minister of Brazil, knowing Roosevelt's love of adventure though, asked why he didn't consider going down an unknown river, Roosevelt jumped at the chance. Such a drastic change of plans threw things into a bit of an uproar, but nevertheless, Roosevelt persisted and had arrangements made for the expanded voyage. So here, this is actually a letter from while Roosevelt was traveling down to South America before this change was made. And he's just saying, oh, I'm just walking on the deck a lot, and it's very nice, and there's lunch, and all that. But the adventure then turned into the Roosevelt-Rondon scientific expedition. So instead of the original path, which would have taken Roosevelt along several well-charted Amazonian rivers, the new expedition was to take his party to the aptly named Rio da Duvida, or in English known as the River of Doubt, because they didn't know where it went. Among his traveling companions were again his son Kermit, who had followed him on the safari in Africa, as well as Colonel Candido Rondon, you can see here next to Roosevelt, who had found the headwaters of the River of Doubt. So these pictures were taken on the way to the River of Doubt. They did a lot of hunting and just going through river travel. So departing from Asunción, Paraguay on December 10th, 1913, Roosevelt and his party made their way north on the Paraguay River for just over a month, during which the expedition party hunted some jaguar, like you can see here, collected numerous samples of the local animals, and had just a small taste of what was to come in terms of the hot weather, frequent downpours, biting insects, illnesses, travel delays, everything. All this was on the safe part of the journey. It was just a prelude to the dangerous part. So from Tapirapuan, where the party rendezvoused on January 16th, 1914, the expedition headed out on the several hundred-mile journey across the Brazilian highlands to the headwaters of the River of Doubt. So even this part of the adventure is still trying to get to the unknown river, to the River of Doubt. This was a very difficult trek, as pack animals died, supplies had to be abandoned, and adjustments to the size of the party had to be made. Because they had to lose the animals and the supplies, they didn't have enough food for everyone. They had to send people off on alternate routes, send people back to civilization. Eventually, after a month, on February 24th, the party arrived near the point where they depart down the river. And after a couple of final days of preparations, after all that, traveling on the river, traveling across the highlands, already several months in, they departed down the river itself. As you can see, this picture here is them taking off down the river. For approximately the next 2 months, Roosevelt and the expedition braved rapids, disease, low rations, threat of attack by natives, injury, and more. Here's another picture of them actually on the river. You can see they're using these sort of dugout canoes that are rather low in the water. So as you might imagine then, when you get to rapids like this, which happened frequently, they had to portage around these, which means they had to lift these huge dugout canoes up, carry them on land, and try and find safer water downstream. This portaging would sometimes take several days, depending on the extent of the rapids. And this time on the banks of the river, rather than on the water itself, exposed the men to additional dangers, including poisonous snakes, stinging insects, and an ominous threat of unseen natives, who they knew would probably be hostile, just based on Colonel Rondon's experience with the natives before. Additionally, their time introduced added complication in that the forest seems to be extremely sparse of animals. There was very little game. Now, when they were planning the expedition, the people thought that they would be able to supplement their rations by hunting. So when they found out that there weren't any animals there, or none that they were able to see, as they had very good camouflage, it became clear that their rations would have to last for a long time, which trying to move dugout canoes, as you can see here, these just great heavy canoes on these kind of wooden rollers, trying to do that on very little food, as you could imagine, would wear people out very quickly. Through it all, though, or at least through much of it, as in Africa, Roosevelt chronicled the events in a series of articles for Scribner's Magazine, which would eventually get turned into his book, Through the Brazilian Wilderness, which I've got a copy of here. I don't know if you can see through the camera, but it kind of chronicles his whole adventure. As you can see, he did his writing in head net and gauntlets because of all the insects. But even just sitting and writing, there were times he wasn't able to do this simply because of the hardship that he had to go through. At one point, he had an attack of malaria that made him just become delirious and not be able to do anything. They were very afraid that Roosevelt would die here in the jungle. Ultimately, though, the party did make it through, adding the river to the map, and in the process, giving it a new name, Rio Roosevelt. As you can see here, although this name was later changed to Rio Teodoro, but it's still named for him today. So this is the party. These are all the porters who helped move those canoes, standing next to the naming of the river. Now, like I said at the beginning, if I had all the time in the world, I could just keep going on about places related to Roosevelt. I could talk about his time in Cambridge, where he attended Harvard. I could talk about Albany, where he was an assemblyman in New York. About Milwaukee, where he was shot. About the Roosevelt Dam in Arizona. About Mount Rushmore. Not even mentioning the time that he's in Washington, D.C. I hope, though, that the 5 places I picked, North Dakota, Cuba, Panama, East Africa, and Brazil, give you an idea of the wide-ranging and strenuous life that Theodore Roosevelt lived. Each of these places shaped, in some way, Theodore Roosevelt's life and how we remember him today. And the primary sources I showed you, all the letters, pictures, movies, and more, help us to understand not only Theodore Roosevelt's life, but the places he visited and the time he lived in. Thank you all very much for taking the time to be here today, and if there are any questions in the time we have left, I'd love to do my best to answer.
How many countries did he travel to total?
Ooh, total, that's a good question. I don't have that number just off the top of my head, but I can tell you he traveled to a lot of countries in Europe. He, just as a child, he went through Germany, France, England. He went to Egypt. He went to Norway to get the Nobel Peace Prize. All the different countries in South America that he went on his tour. So I would guess easily over a dozen different countries.
How many animals did he kill?
Ooh. In his life or just on one of the expeditions? In his life, lots and lots and lots. On one of the expeditions, I know he said just tens of thousands. So he was a very, very big hunter.
What kinds of animals did he kill?
Well, it depends where he was. So, as I mentioned, when he went to North Dakota, he was hunting buffalo, and there are also deer here, so he hunted deer. Later in his life, you might know from the teddy bear is when he didn't kill a bear, but at other points in his life, he did go bear hunting. On safari, he hunted elephants, rhinoceroses, zebra, giraffes, all the big game you can think of. In the Amazon, he hunted I know they shot some alligators, I believe, some tapirs, jaguars, so just all different sorts of animals that you can think of.
After he was president, did he still like hunting?
After he was president, did he still like hunting? He did. After he was president, that's when he went on the safari to do the hunting, and that's when he went to the Amazon. He did, his view of hunting kind of changed a little bit though, because he still did like hunting, but he also recognized that it was important to try and preserve animals and not hunt all the animals, but to try and get some to show other people. So he did still like hunting, yes, but his views of hunting kind of changed a little.
What did he do with most of the animals he killed?
A lot of them, well, when he was a boy, he really liked doing taxidermy. So he would stuff these animals and create little forms for them, like you saw with the rhinoceroses. Some he donated to museums, some he ate for food, some he just had decorating his house. Lots of good questions here today.
What did he invent? Did he invent anything else except the teddy bear?
Did he invent anything? I don't think he invented anything. Nothing's coming to mind off the top of my head. But he didn't invent things, but he created things. Like I said, he created the United States Forest Service, and he created lots of national parks and game reserves. So he created a bunch of places, but he didn't have like an invention per se.
What gun did he use to hunt?
What gun did he use to hunt? That's good. We've got a couple letters that actually say it, but I don't know a lot about guns. I know he had a Winchester hunting rifle and a couple shotguns, but I'm not sure of the details. Lots of good questions. Anybody else have a good one? Like I said, I'll do my best.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been great talking to you.